This looks like such a complex scene, yet it's surprisingly easy to draw if we think about it the right way. Let me explain you how to break it down, then talk you through my drawing of it, and then you can get a copy of this reference photo from my channel community page and have a go drawing it yourself. Part of the reason a scene such as this looks so complex is because there are lots of parts. So the first thing is to break down in our minds what we're looking at so it doesn't look as difficult. So for instance, if I said, can you draw this? It's not nearly as overwhelming as saying, can you draw this? So this becomes, if you like, stage one to draw. Well, here, down, and here across. This is the section of the rooftops that are closest to us. And so to help show that, I'm going to use a 0.5 millimeter pen to give a thicker line that will hopefully sit forward, just creating the visual effect of closeness. So I'm going to come across here, and down here. Now these are larger and relatively simpler forms, and when I first draw them, I'm not going to worry about these divisions between the different roofing panels, and that will simplify it further. And I'm not going to worry so much about all of these chimney pots. I'll leave room for them, and I'll try not to do lines that go through where they need to stand up, but I'm not going to overly worry about them. And when I do draw them, they're not the sort of detail that I need to get exactly right. This is a good example where drawing the effect of the detail can work just as well as drawing the detail. So how do I go once I've drawn this more straightforward, relatively simpler part? Well, at that stage, I've basically got this left to go. But I can break this down further as well, and reduce it now to this, what I would think of as a mid-ground zone. So to do this, I'm going to drop to a 0.3 millimeter pen to give me a slightly lighter line. And the thing I need to remember when I draw this is to draw the larger, more obvious shapes first. So in this case, it's going to be this building here, this building here, this building here, this rooftop here, this building here, and not to get bogged down with where there's a lot of little bits of detail, because if I draw these larger elements in the right spots, I can really just suggest this detail that sits in between some of these larger elements. If these larger spots are properly placed and properly drawn, then that gives me a lot of leeway with all of these little bits of details that, if you like, are the glue filling in around them. Now, once, therefore, I've done these, I'm left with this. I'm basically left with the Hôtel de Ville, the Paris town hall, as the major part of what's left. There's just some little bits in the distance on the left-hand side and a few little bits sticking up in between the various rooftop elements, and there's an even smaller little wedge on the right-hand side. So I'm going to use a 0.1 millimeter pen to do those, and I'll try and draw them just extremely lightly and suggestedly, and I'm going to use a 0.2 millimeter pen for the Hôtel de Ville, and I'm not going to be trying to draw too much of the detail at all. The other important thing to realize, which makes drawing this a lot easier, is that once I've got this relatively simpler lower section done, if I place all of the elements as accurately as I can across the width of the drawing, then I can use them to align the parts above. The other thing that's helpful to remember is that with a building such as this, the biggest challenge will be to keep it compressed this way. Because it's kind of horizontal bands, it's very easy to let the width of each band slip just a little bit more than it should. And when you add that little extra bit all the way up, instead of our Hôtel de Ville finishing here, it can easily finish here. So I'm going to start with a 0.5 millimeter pen, and you'll notice that I actually start with this line across here. I find that again, in a scene such as this, where the temptation will be to get out of proportion as we move up, if I start in the middle and work down and then up, there's less chance of that distortion creeping in to such an extent by the time I get to the top. So let's start drawing. So I start with the 0.5 millimeter pen with this near horizontal line across the near center of the page. And I'm, as I mentioned, really at this point trying to draw in some of the larger shapes that are here and get the spaces between the horizontal lines accurate, and then to start to position some of the larger objects that sit on the roof, such as the dormer windows and the skylights, the chimneys and the space between chimneys. Sometimes trying to see the forms of the roof as simply shapes, rectangular boxes of a certain proportion, is a good way to try and place the individual objects that sit on or around the roof. And so having got some of these outlines, I now start to put some of the details of this aluminium zinc paneling, that the colour of which really does characterise so much of the Paris skyline, when so much of it is seen all at once so often. And now moving across with this chimney, that wide chimney on the lower right, which gives us a nice blank space, which is a nice contrast to some of the detail in the upper left hand of our scene. And it really is a case when some parts have a lot of clutter to draw the simpler, easier to place shapes, and then, if you like, just fill the clutter in around, but to just try and capture the effect of the clutter, knock the exactness, just as we do with leaves on a tree. So you see me now placing this little dormer here and just some other details. And now I've got the slightly more complex lower right section just above this large chimney with all these chimney pots and the like. And this roof going off in the lower right, which I really took too far to the right. It goes past what should have been the boundary of my drawing. I often place 4 pencil dots around the 4 corners of where I want my scene to finish when I film, because I don't want it going off camera. I switch now to my 0.3 millimeter pen and start to do this central midground. In some ways this is the more challenging, because with this distance there is more detail that we see. When we go higher up and there's even more distance and more detail, the effect of the distance at that point means we can draw less. But at this stage we're not losing so much that we really need to draw, and there's just a bit more of it. So as I think I mentioned earlier, with this midground, the way I'm thinking is to place these more obvious larger structures as accurately as I can across the width, aligning with items beneath them in my reference and then therefore in my drawing. And then almost doing them separately as little islands, if you like. And then where there's masses of detail of chimney pots and rooftop pipes and vents and air conditioners and television aerials and the like, just then doing a few gestural lines to create the effect of all this clutter in between these larger areas that were easier to draw and easier to place. And that way I don't let distortions caused in my placement of lines when I'm drawing all this massive little detail that no one can make out anyway, end up not letting me then place my major elements where they need to go. So I place the major elements first. I'm doing this fairly central one now, and then the building that sits behind it, and then there's a rooftop on the left hand side that I also place. You can see I'm being very gestural with these windows now. I'm not trying to do the same detail I might have done if they'd been a lot closer. Always a challenge for me. And you can see with my roofs, I tried to create two different textures for two different buildings with my lines to represent the various tiers of tiles. Okay, so now I'm trying to position on the vertical this larger roof that we see side on, and then between that we get a glimpse of the Hotel de Ville with this large tree and some other trees in front of it. But if I place this, now I can just draw the effect of the chimney pots and aerials and the like to the left and to the right. Because the eye is going to go, in this case, to the larger, more solid, easier to make out objects. So I've now switched to the 0.2 millimeter fine liner, which is a little bit dry in ink, but that kind of works well because I do want a very light line now for the Hotel de Ville, particularly because it's the most complex form that I'm going to be drawing, but also one which is quite a long way back. I really do want overall to have a lighter impression than I have for the other building, other architectural elements. So again, although it looks complex, it's actually a series of relatively simple shapes of long rectangles and boxes that sit on top of each other. It's really only the roof line to the left of the building that starts to get a little bit complicated. The important thing, I think, is to establish the proportions of these boxes that the windows will sit in. Do that accurately and then make the windows and whatever else we draw sit into those long boxes. So we establish the proportions before we put the detail in. And as you can see, I'm being very light with my interpretation of the detail, but it certainly does still create the effect that this is a grand building. And now there's a very strong foreshortening along the left of the building as we look along it here. And so we have to be careful just to draw what we see and not what we might remember the building looks like from another direction. So I go a little bit too high with this part of the drawing, but it still, I think, works. So now it's a case having got most of this done, keeping it fairly gestural. There's the details on the roof that stretch along. Again, I drew these details a bit large, and that means that when I went to put some of these longer horizontal roof elements on, I couldn't do it and keep them to the right proportion. There just wasn't space to make them as long and thin as they should have been. But again, fortunately, these details do tend to get lost in the clutter of the roof and of the details behind as well. So it's not really such a problem. There were just a few little bits there that I missed. And now I've got my 0.1 millimeter pen, and I'm just adding these modern buildings at the left and the right, a crane. And you can see I just keep the lines hanging back slightly from the Hotel de Ville just to give a little sense of visual separation and make it easier to see what's happening there. And then I realized I've forgotten a few details on the Hotel de Ville itself. So I get my 0.2 and I finish those as well. And at that point, my Paris rooftop scene is pretty well done. What do you think? It does look a complex scene, but it's not as hard as it looks. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Well, I hope you got from this the sense of if we break it down, it's not that difficult. We just need to be a little methodical. And I really hope you go to the community page, you get the reference, you have a go drawing it. And I really hope and kind of suspect that you'll be surprised, nicely surprised at how well your drawing turns out for such a complex appearing scene. But look, whatever you draw and however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.